There is a name not in the Australian school curriculum. A man who killed at least 7 people across multiple states over years, investigated by police forces that did not share information, who kept killing between investigations because the system was not designed to connect the dots across jurisdictions. His name is Eric Edgar Cooke. He killed in Perth in the 1950s and 60s. Some victims were attributed to him only decades after his 1964 execution. Almost nobody outside Western Australia knows his name. This is the problem with Australia's serial killer history. It exists in documented, prosecuted, formally recorded form, but the curriculum gives students Gallipoli, the Gold Rush, Federation, the Stolen Generations, not the predatory violence that occurred in Australian cities, roads, and homes, whose examination says specific things about policing, the treatment of vulnerable populations, and the conditions that let violence continue undetected. This video is not a celebration of violence. It's the argument that this history deserves examination, that the people killed deserve to be named, and that the institutional failures that let the killings continue deserve scrutiny. Stay to the end. Number 1 produced the longest confirmed serial killing timeline in Australian history. A man who killed for 6 years across multiple states, caught not by police work but by a single welfare fraud audit. You know this one. The teaching version, honest, complete, institutionally examined, is not what most people know. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Let's begin. 20th century Australia had, by comparable international standards, a largely unacknowledged relationship to serial predatory violence. The cases here span the 1920s to the 1990s, involving men who killed in cities, forests, on roads, and in houses. Police limited by jurisdiction and technology, and victims whose vulnerability to poverty, isolation, marginalisation, was part of the mechanism that let the killing continue. These are Australian stories. They happened here. They are not taught here. 12 of them. Starting now. Number 12. Eric Edgar Cooke and the case Perth carried alone. Cooke was executed at Fremantle Prison on October 26, 1964, the last person executed in Western Australia. Between 1959 and 1963, he killed at least 8 people in Perth and committed dozens of other violent offences, shootings, stabbings, hit-and-runs, terrorising the city for 4 years. What makes him significant beyond the body count is the character of his violence and the investigation. He had no victim type, used different methods in different suburbs. The randomness was deliberate, making him hard to identify as a single perpetrator. Perth in the early 1960s had roughly 400,000 people. Investigators had no DNA, no CCTV, no cross-jurisdictional databases, only physical evidence and testimony, applied to a man specifically evading the pattern recognition those tools relied on. 2 innocent men, John Button and Darryl Beamish, were convicted of individual Cooke murders and imprisoned before his eventual confession. The injustice of a random pattern killer operating in a system that requires pattern to identify a perpetrator. Cooke confessed before execution to 8 murders, several previously attributed to others or unsolved. The true toll may be higher but was never confirmed. Perth changed how it lived during those years. Doors locked, no walking alone, then stopped being afraid once Cooke was caught, then discovered 2 men had served years for his crimes. Number 11. Arnold Soedman and the 4 little girls who did not come home. Between 1930 and 1936, 4 young girls were murdered in Victoria and New South Wales, each approached by a friendly adult male near a public area, taken a short distance, and killed with no witnesses. Arnold Soedman, a labourer working across both states, was caught in 1936 after murdering 6-year-old June Rushmer near Leongatha. His confession covered all 4 murders across 6 years, with genuine remorse expressed to the court and families. Soedman was medically assessed with a neurological condition, later understood as temporal lobe pathology, argued to have produced the violent episodes with no memory afterward. Rejected at trial, he was convicted and hanged in 1936. The case sits at the intersection of early forensic medicine, 1930s psychiatric limits, and how law handles neurological impairment in violent crime. Questions still live today. The 4 girls, Mina Griffiths, Ethel Belshaw, Hazel Wilson, and June Rushmer, deserve their names in the record. They are not in any curriculum, only in court documents and local histories. Number 10. The Wanda Beach murders and the file that is still open. On January 11, 1965, 15-year-olds Christine Sharrock and Marion Schmidt were murdered at Wanda Beach near Cronulla, walking the dunes during a group day trip. Their bodies were found later that day. The case generated the largest police investigation in New South Wales history to that point. thousands interviewed, years in the newspapers, multiple re-investigations since. No one has ever been charged. 2 girls murdered in daylight, in public, on an ordinary summer day disturbed a community whose 1965 assumptions held that violent crime happened elsewhere, to others. Suspects have been identified at various points. None has met the standard required for prosecution across more than 50 years. The families have lived with this for 60 years. The case sits in the cold case files, absent from any curriculum. Number 9. Peter Dupas and the system that released him repeatedly. Dupas killed 3 women in Victoria in 1997 and 1999, convicted in 2004, 2006, and 2007, serving multiple life sentences. That's the outcome. The story before it is what nobody teaches. Dupas had a documented history of violent sexual offending beginning in 1968 at age 15. Between 1968 and 1994 he was convicted, imprisoned, and released multiple times, offending again between releases. How does someone with a documented, escalating history across 2 decades go on to kill 3 women? The answer combines factors: parole decisions based on risk assessments, his subsequent behavior disproved, insufficient post-release supervision, and a system without adequate mechanisms to prevent what his history was predicting. Nicole Patterson, Margaret Mayer, and Mersina Halvages were killed in that gap. Reforms informed directly by this case exist because 3 women died before anyone decided the system needed to change. A case study in preventable deaths, not a horror story. Number 8. Ivan Milat and whether 7 was the complete count. Milat was convicted in 1996 of murdering 7 backpackers found in the Belanglo State Forest south of Sydney between 1992 and 1993, sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms, and died in prison in 2019. Whether 7 was the complete count has never been resolved. A long-distance truck driver for decades before the bodies were found, Milat was convicted for the 7 found at that site, but other travellers who disappeared on Australian roads in preceding decades, in circumstances matching his method, were never attributed to him. Investigators considered additional cases. Some were excluded on evidentiary grounds, some remain open. Milat denied further killings, then late in life made statements investigators read as potentially indicating a higher count, dying without confirming or denying. Public consciousness holds Milat as Australia's worst serial killer case. The institutional story, 1980s-90s hitchhiking culture, the highway corridor concentration of victims, the unresolved count, is what's missing. The named victims have memorials. The additional cases have open files. Number 7. John Wayne Glover and the pattern that took too long to see. Between 1989 and 1990, 6 elderly women were murdered in Sydney's North Shore, connected by method, victim profile, and geography, all struck with a hammer. The case became known as the Granny Killer Murders. Glover, a pie salesman delivering to nursing homes in the area, was arrested in 1990, convicted of all 6 murders, sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms, and died in prison in 2005. The institutional story is timing. 6 women murdered the same way in the same area over roughly 12 months before a suspect emerged. The challenge was victim profile: elderly women living alone, whose deaths generated less forensic urgency than younger, more connected victims would. This isn't an indictment of the investigation itself, which was ultimately successful, but a structural observation about how victim profile shapes urgency. It sits in Sydney's public memory, not in any curriculum. Number 6. Martha Rendell and the stepchildren who were poisoned. Rendell was executed in Perth in 1909, one of only 3 women executed in Western Australia and the last. She was convicted of murdering a stepchild by painting their throat with hydrochloric acid. 3 of 4 children in her care died, the surviving child's testimony central to conviction. Rendell was the de facto partner of Thomas Rendell, the 4 children his from a previous relationship. As the children fell ill sequentially, concerns from the biological family prompted a medical examination. Establishing their throats were deliberately irritated with acid under the guise of treatment. The case is significant as one of the earliest documented Australian examples of familial violence against non-biological children by a caregiver, and sits at the intersection of gender, colonial-era justice, and working-class family life in early Federation Australia. The names of the 3 children who died, Annie, Olive, and Arthur Rendell, are in the court records, absent from any curriculum. Number 5. The Truro murders and the accomplice who said nothing. Between December 1976 and February 1977, Christopher Worrell murdered 7 young women in South Australia, picking them up hitchhiking between Adelaide and the Barossa Valley. Accomplice James Miller was present for some killings and helped dispose of bodies. Worrell died in a car accident in February 1977. Miller, the only surviving person with knowledge, said nothing for 2 years. While families waited, the investigation continued without its central witness, and bodies remained undiscovered. Miller confessed in 1979, leading police to the bodies, and was sentenced to life. Truro establishes how one person's 2-year silence after 7 murders left 7 investigations incomplete, shaping the legal treatment of accomplice silence in ways South Australia's justice system has never fully publicised. 7 names. 2 years of silence. 1 confession. The Barossa Valley Road carries this history. The wine tourism doesn't mention it. Number 4. Paul Denier and the Summer That Changed Frankston. Over just 38 days in June-July 1993, 3 young women were murdered in Frankston, on Melbourne's southeastern periphery, in daylight, in public areas, in a community that rapidly changed how it moved through its own suburb. Women stopped walking alone, parks and paths emptied. Denier, then 21, was arrested in July 1993 and confessed to all 3, sentenced to a minimum 30 years. The murders drove real changes to public safety infrastructure: better lighting on walking paths, emergency phones along isolated routes, community safety programs. Similar suburbs developed in response. Denier made headlines again in 2019 and 2022, applying for, and being denied, gender recognition in the Victorian legal system, sparking ongoing public debate. Elizabeth Stevens, Deborah Freem, and Natalie Russell were killed in 38 days in a suburb still shaped by that winter. The safety changes their deaths produced continuing to benefit those communities, a debt not formally acknowledged. Number 3. The Snowtown Network and the institutional story behind Australia's worst serial killings. This entry examines how a killing network operating for 6 years in suburban South Australia went undetected. The answer: welfare fraud detection. 12 people were killed between 1992 and 1999 by a network in northern Adelaide suburbs. The detection pathway wasn't a missing persons investigation. It was an administrative audit of welfare payments collected in the names of people who couldn't be located, by the same people who had killed them. The victims weren't detected through channels designed to find missing people. They were detected through channels designed to find fraud. That answers how such a network operates for 6 years. The victims came from marginalised communities with loose institutional connections, whose absence could be explained and whose payments kept flowing within the network that killed them. The trial established the facts. The institutional examination established the system, since changed, partially. Whose disappearance generates what level of response remains not fully answered. Number 2. The argument for teaching this history. Each of the 11 cases examined shares something more significant than the violence itself. Viewed institutionally, each reveals something about how Australian society has managed, or failed to manage, protection from predatory violence. Cooke reveals what happens when a random pattern killer operates without cross-case analytical capacity. Dupas reveals what happens when documented escalating risk meets an inadequate system. Wanda Beach reveals what a 60-year-old unsolved case means for families. Glover reveals how victim profile shapes urgency. Snowtown reveals the link between marginalisation and detection. These aren't horror stories. They're institutional case studies in social conditions, capacity, and preventable deaths. The curriculum gives students the gold rush. It doesn't give them this. Both are Australian history. One is more useful for understanding the country Australia currently is. Number 1. The Snowtown case and the complete account. This isn't the most dramatic case here. It's the one that most completely represents this video's argument. Australia's serial killing history is an institutional record as much as a crime record, worth teaching as such. Snowtown is known. A film exists. Trial records are public. Missing from the curriculum is the trial's institutional finding. The network operated for 6 years because the people it killed weren't considered important enough for the system to look for with urgency. The 12 victims were chosen partly for vulnerability, marginality, disconnection from institutions, lives where absence could be explained and payments kept flowing in their names. The killers understood, intuitively, that these disappearances wouldn't generate the response other people's would. This isn't unique to Snowtown. Glover's victims were elderly women whose deaths lacked the urgency younger victims would carry. The Truro victims were hitchhiking women whose disappearances, in 1970s terms, read as mobility. Wanda Beach's victims were found and identified, and still no charges. The names that should be known aren't the perpetrators. Those are already in the record because the system requires it. They're the victims, all of them, in the full institutional context of what their deaths produced and haven't yet produced. Australia teaches Gallipoli. Australia should also teach the names in these files. Share this video. Subscribe. And next time someone tells you Australian history is too clean to be complicated, show them this. See you in the next one.